Let me ask you a question. Is science always objective? Today, we're going to dive deep into a really provocative argument. It suggests that a hidden political imbalance in the social sciences might actually be skewing what we think we know about society. And trust me, this isn't just some dusty campus debate. It gets right to the heart of how we all understand the world around us.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to see just how lopsided this academic landscape really is. Then we'll get into the why, like why does it even matter? After that, we'll look at why the usual fixes might not be working. And then we get to the really challenging idea in this paper that science might need a new conservative paradigm to find real balance. And finally, we'll connect it all back to the real world.
All right, so what exactly is the problem we're talking about? Let's kick things off with a single, pretty shocking number.
Get this, the source material we're looking at estimates that for every one conservative social scientist, there are more than 10 liberals. Now, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, a ratio like that, well, it definitely makes you ask some questions.
And that's the real kicker, isn't it? A statistic is just a number. But does this kind of intellectual monoculture actually damage the scientific process itself? To figure that out, we need to look at some classic arguments.
To answer that big question, the paper we're examining goes back to some classic philosophy. The whole argument for why diversity matters is really built on two powerful ideas about how we find truth in the first place.
And these ideas come from two key thinkers. What's so interesting is that they're working more than a century apart, but they basically land in a very similar spot. We've got the famous 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill and the contemporary philosopher of science Mill and Longino.
Mill's idea is just so powerful. He basically said, look, we're all human, we're all fallible. So the only way we get closer to the truth, especially on big, complicated social issues, is through what he called a struggle between combatants. It's not about one side winning and the other losing. It's about the better, more complete idea that gets forged in the fire of real debate between people who genuinely disagree.
Okay, now fast forward 100 years, and Mill and Longino gives this argument a modern update for the world of science. She says that values are an inevitable part of doing science. They shape the questions we ask, the data we focus on, everything. So for her, true objectivity isn't some godlike value-free perspective. No, it's much more like that old story of the blind man and the elephant. You know, each person is touching a different part, the trunk, the leg, the tail, and thinks they know what the whole thing is. You only get the complete picture when you bring all those partial, limited perspectives together and let them critique each other's blind spots.
So, if we all agree that this kind of viewpoint diversity is so important, how do we fix the imbalance? Well, the paper digs into two of the most common suggestions and basically argues that, yeah, they both fall short. The first proposed fix is pretty straightforward. Just tell scientists to be more rigorous, right? Try harder to keep your personal politics out of your work. The second idea is what's called artificial diversity. This is where you ask scientists to basically play devil's advocate, to really try and think like their ideological opponents.
But here's the thing with artificial diversity. We just don't know what we don't know. The paper argues that it's pretty unrealistic to ask a progressive scientist to truly inhabit a conservative worldview, or vice versa. They're missing the deep-seated knowledge, the different starting points, and frankly, the genuine passion of someone who sincerely believes in that perspective.
Okay, now to really get to the bottom of this, the analysis makes a really critical distinction. Because it turns out, not all ideological influence is the same. It can show up in two very, very different ways. So on the one hand, you have what's called scholar-activism. This is the stuff that's pretty obvious, right? It's overt, it's transparent, and it sometimes puts political goals ahead of scientific rules. But the paper argues the deeper, more stable threat is something it calls paradigmatic progressivism. And this is way more subtle because it operates within all the accepted rules of science, which makes it much, much harder to even notice.
And the analogy the paper uses here is just perfect. A paradigm is like the water the fish swim in. The fish has no idea it's wet, right? It's reality. And that's the idea here. A paradigm is that collection of unspoken, background assumptions that shapes what questions seem important and what answers seem believable. The scientists inside it can feel completely objective because the water itself is invisible to them.
This brings us right to the heart of the paper, and to its most direct and probably most controversial proposal for how you deal with an invisible paradigm. First, the paper makes a distinction between two ways to create diversity. One way is what it calls ecumenical heterodoxy. That's a fancy way of saying you just gather all the critics into one big tent. But the author says what's really needed is perspectival pluralism, which means building a totally separate, coherent, and competing intellectual framework, a real alternative. So here's the core logic, step by step.
1. Social science and our big public debates are often about the exact same things: crime, family, inequality, you name it. 2. The paper argues that right now, these fields are dominated by a progressive paradigm and its assumptions. 3. This creates a huge blind spot. There are entire ways of understanding the world that just aren't on the table. So, the conclusion? 4. A distinct conservative paradigm is a necessary corrective to challenge those hidden assumptions.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to be clear about what this proposal is and what it is not. It is not about political activism for the right. It is not about starting with conservative conclusions and then trying to work backwards to prove them. What it is about starting from different premises, like maybe an emphasis on tradition or individual responsibility, and then rigorously following the scientific method to see where it leads. The whole point isn't to be right, but to be a tool that critiques, challenges, and ultimately improves the dominant way of thinking.
So let's zoom out for the final stretch. Why should anyone who's not in a university care about any of this? Well, as it turns out, the consequences are very, very real.
This whole academic debate is happening at a time of a real crisis in social trust. Public trust in academia has been dropping, and that drop is especially sharp among conservatives. And when a huge portion of the public starts seeing universities as just another partisan institution, their credibility and their authority take a major hit.
And this brings us to what the author sees as the ultimate payoff, what they call a twofold benefit. The first benefit is epistemic. That's just a fancy word for knowledge. The idea is we'd get better, stronger, more valid science through real debate. But the second benefit is social. By fostering this real pluralism, it could help restore public trust and strengthen science's vital role in a democratic society.
And so this all leaves us with one central massive question to chew on. Is creating rival intellectual frameworks the key to a healthier, more objective science? Or would it just end up importing our endless political battles directly into the halls of the academy and entrenching our divisions even deeper? It's a huge question, and the answer could really shape the future of how we search for truth.